Hi everyone, hope you're all right. Saying that, I of course start all of these things with a hi everyone, when it could well be that the technology isn't working. And especially this time of night, this is not a usual streaming hour for me, so it could well be that I've not clicked the right buttons, and it may well be that I'm talking into the ether, which you lot might prefer, knowing your usual heckling. So points and prizes for whoever is first on the chat on the various platforms of which we're streaming to. So I thought I'd put this out on the normal feeds that I usually do Chewing It Over as a Chewing It Over special, just because I've got everything set up. I did an episode today with Greg Lemon, for example. I thought I'll just rechange the titles and stuff. So it's going to YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and what else? Twitter, Twitch. So there's a few different places, and most of them, when you comment on the chat, then it shows me, and I can bring them up on screen, and I will try to get to as many of your questions as I can. Thanks to Luke. He's said he's putting the kids to bed, so don't speak too loud. Good luck with that, Luke. Unfortunately, both a loud person and a bassy voice that reverberates throughout your house, which you, I'm sure, well know. So, yeah, I'm afraid. I hope I don't wake your kids, but I can't promise anything. Thanks for those that are tuning in live. But of course, this is something that is mainly just for us to put as a matter of public record, especially for those that submitted questions ahead of time saying they couldn't make the live stream, just to send some questions. But unfortunately for me, I got 52 questions. So I've had to put them into like themes and categories and stuff. And so I'm going to do my best to get through them and obviously engage you as much as I can in that time. But realistically, I just wanted to cover some of the bases that you sort of felt that you wanted to hear from me on. There are other opportunities to discuss these sorts of things, including with the other candidates, which I'm really looking forward to. On Monday, there is a physio talk, so hashtag physio talk on Twitter for you to keep an eye out on that, or to watch if you're not able to get involved live and ask questions of me and the other candidates, then you can look at that afterwards. But certainly, I just wanted to make sure that I, as is the sort of spirit of what I try to do all the time, is to truly be open to all questions and challenges and themes that you wanted me to discuss, some of which people wanted me to pick up on old views of mine that they've heard about me and the CSP, and then other times where it's something that they've said, I've not really heard you muse on your take on this. And so it's been a really interesting thing to get your questions. The themes that we have, let me just pull those up. So there's some that are more general, which I'll come to first. Then there's trade union issues, EDI issues, professional body issues, and then there's like a miscellaneous category. So I've got both general and miscellaneous, because there was some stuff that were difficult to categorize, and I've literally been putting them on the screen on the system as best I could, like right up to the moment I was coming live. So forgive me for that. But yeah, thanks to those that are joining live. Feel free to participate. I will be coming to your comments and stuff as best I can, but then I will also be honouring those questions that came in from people saying that they couldn't necessarily join live, but we're going to be watching the recording, which of course is most people that engage with Chewing It Over stuff anyway. For those that are new around here, we stream 12:30 till 1 o'clock Mondays, and it's now Thursdays, and I keep forgetting to change this pretty surround that we use, and so yeah, sorry about that, but I'll remember it one day. So please feel free to join us on live streams during the week, especially we talk about all things that intersect particularly with MSK practice, but also wider healthcare and cultural issues too. Just gonna, it's unnecessary to have my name on there twice, so that's bugging me. Let's remove that. Okay, and let's jump in. What was my, not first question, but what I've put up as first? One of the most common things that have been asked, some housekeeping stuff, which I'll answer alongside this. What does CSP Council do is a fair question to ask me, but certainly one that I would encourage you to look up on the CSP's website. But it is a fair question, and one that a number of you have asked. It is essentially the governing body in a sense of this. It's staff-based, but then it says it has its elected voluntary council, which is a set of lay members of various different backgrounds that put themselves forward to do a 4-year term on a council. It's changed its face recently with regards to its format. It used to have particular elected people that were representative of a constituency of a sort that could be regional, or it could be from professional groups, and making sure that then it had it was differently delineated. You had people that were otherwise like different sectors and all sorts of different bits like that. And then they got a body of 12 people, and there was a change in governance that went through, which I was very supportive of at the time. And a number of people voted from that, told me that they were sort of moved to vote on that. They thought that was a good idea, like a governance reform, I think in 2018. So I think 4 years ago, and I think they're coming to term now. And so that's what changed. And so now that council, things from professional committees, not just professional committees, but like the various committees, which I'll talk about in a bit, that support and feed in and advise council, as well as then things like the reps conference that I was at earlier in the week. These things all advise council, a group of people that then help to make decisions strategically, and don't get involved really in sort of operational stuff. It's what drives the strategic decision making of the organisation. So that's kind of a gist. If I've got something wrong there, then that's a mistake. I do my best to understand these issues. It's not as if I've just recently swatted up on them necessarily. I feel like I do pay attention to this sort of stuff, as is kind of my job really on the commentary side. But there's also a couple of tech questions, or not tech, is it? Sorry, operational questions that people have asked. Like, why is it paper ballots? So I'm not going to get stuck into that, but I know it will come up in the chat if I don't address it. Why does it have to be on paper? There's certain trade union mandates that come through that mean you can't necessarily just go rogue and run a spreadsheet or a survey monkey or something like that, right? It's got to be formal. There are certain reforms that could be made there that I think could make it a bit more sort of modern day, but at the moment, it is that if you want to vote in this election for me or anyone, then you need to make sure you get your ballot paper sent. It will go to the address of which is registered with the CSP. So a lot of people contacted me saying it's gone to an old address. I have no idea where it's going. I've never voted before, so I've never even noticed one. So that's something that you need to look into, and contact them to try and see if you can get a ballot issued to wherever your current address is and update your details, I imagine. This has been a common one. Why now? And I think it's an absolutely fair point. There's a few reasons, but one of the main ones is the absolute timing with regards to the professional position within healthcare and the healthcare's position in society, for want of a better term, like the state of flux of chaos of a sort, the realignment that needs to occur, obviously post-COVID, but even prior to COVID, the circumstances of which where we're at in terms of the sort of politics, the aging demographics, the ailing demographics. There's just a number of things, particularly nationally, but even across the world, of course, that mean that then healthcare is having a real serious look at itself. And so I feel like if ever, in terms of temperament and in terms of style, it seems that disorder, that disruption that is inherent, and sort of managing within that sort of seems to be something that I'm more used to over my career. And it's something that then means that there are other times, other phases of which I don't think it would be appropriate, in which I wouldn't be a positively disruptive force. And so the timing feels right for me in that regard. There's also a number of other factors that have come into play that have sort of seen me over the line a little bit. One of which was the last round of elections, where I supported some candidates that really impressed me, but also the whole ballot, the people that I didn't really know very well, that whole roster. I was impressed by that, and I thought, God, this passion's really coming through, and it really inspired me to sort of put my money where my mouth was and get stuck in myself this time. So that's one factor, as well as then other things that I have been critical of on the CSP before. And I think it's absolutely valid that eventually someone says, go on, then could you do better, or could you positively influence from within as well as from without? And I think that, eventually that is something that has moved me. I don't think it's always the best argument. I think there's absolutely reasonable critique that can come without you having to run for something like this. But 10 years of noise making now on the internet, that's absolutely fair enough. But when the time was right in other ways, that I was moved to throw my hat in. So that's why now. This one's a fairly easy one. I'll try and be quick. What do you want to achieve? Realistically, in terms of sort of a personal agenda, I don't really want to achieve anything specifically. Like, I don't think that's wise. I don't think that's appropriate for a council position. I think there are certain issues, if I was really passionate about them. There are certain issues I'm really passionate about, but I suppose it's more like I would join a committee and try to influence that for a period of time, or the things that I have done with the CSP, like short life working groups over say standards, or lending myself to review that's occurred, which I have done recently as well, such as the sort of private sector review that went on recently. So that stuff I would do if I had certain either skin in that game or particularly fervent views about a certain topic. Whereas this really isn't about you. It can't be about me or having an agenda or a plan. It'd be more about me lending my sort of style, I guess, or sort of try my reasoned approach to all issues that might be brought to council. So it shouldn't really be about what I want to achieve. It would definitely be this in this instance for the group, for the collective, and I think it's appropriate to do that because of the timing of it, right? So it's not. It's not as if, even if I wanted to try and somehow use this as a Trojan horse for some sort of agenda of my own, then generally, I just don't think it's either the appropriate organ for doing so, but also I think that the timing is such that then you are not necessarily as a council adjudicating and being brought material from time gone by, and there's a strategy that's been put in place from your predecessors and stuff like that. So that's kind of a thing I wanted to admit, and also that includes to those that sort of, if you're wrongly going to be tempted to sort of vote for me, thinking that you could. That there'd be some sort of retrofit from suggestions of policies that I might have brought up before in commentary, that you think that that'd then be what I'd be trying to push for necessarily inside. It's not really the case, and I do want to admit that this is definitely sort of a big picture thing that I want to just lend my support to the wider council. And I have had sort of suggestions as well that the point I've just made there has been supported by sort of colleagues, friends, mentors of mine that have said such things. I'm surrounded by various people that have chaired council before, current members of council that have given me recent insights, and that's definitely how I'm feeling about this, really. And I would admit it. I'd be bringing it up on screen if I was like, here's my goals and targets. I'm sorry if I'm being a bit vaguer than I'd normally like to be on something like that, but generally speaking, it's not really about me on that, really. This was a favourite. It came up a few times, actually. Do you reckon anyone will vote for me? Yeah, I'm not sure. It's a funny one, this, isn't it? Can you? Sometimes social media can be a bit of a popularity contest, but also you know that a certain proportion of people are following purely because that's sometimes where the conversation happens. I think one of the things that's interesting is that I'm hearing and have heard over the years about our as Physio Matters audience aren't typical CSP voters. So they tell me, and so can I, or if people would want to or be moved to vote for me in this instance, do they think it's a good idea? Do they think I'm a good fit? That's unknown. It's also an unknown as to those that do typically vote in elections. I think it's about 7% of the membership typically. Are they going to be interested in what I've had to say? Are they aware of any of my other work? It's a massive unknown. I have absolutely no idea. But the big boy, I've got thick skin. I assure you that I don't mind, and I'll learn. I'll learn from whatever happens. I don't mind. I'll get over it. But I really will enjoy. In a way, I will. Most enjoy the banter if I end up getting a nil point, something like a Eurovision Song Contest. This was a good one that captured an awful lot in Awana. And I thought as best I could about this, but it came in fairly late, so I wasn't able to really write anything down, but I'll do my best to see if I can get to three of each, because I think it's a fair question, but I will forget something. Three things that I like. I want to try and be as tangible as I can. There's something that I've always really highly recommended. It was a really well nuanced statement that's probably due for refreshing, but by a lady led by a lady called Sally Gosling a number of years ago now, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, but it was the CSP's evidence-based practice statement. And it was the reason I mention it, and I always do, is because it was something that was a really nice piece of sort of it really captured a moment where you want to be guided by and informed by the evidence, but not then using it narrowly, that then would encroach on professional judgment in such a way that then deferred responsibility. And I felt like, I remember at the time just thinking, this really captures something. And I think, unfortunately, there were a couple of subsequent papers and policy suggestions from the CSP that just didn't seem to capture that spirit the same way. And I think it's something that should always be looked back on. And I always admire that piece of work, and I think it stands really well today. I think it was really quite ahead of its time, and where we've come to learn. And I remember where I was personally, and continue to be on that pendulum between sort of empiricism and then sort of practice-based evidence. It's an interesting one. I think that was brilliant. I really like the current MSK standards that have recently been published. I was part of the early sort of conversation about that, but I think that was really well done and well, me and part of what the big R's and MSK reform was about. Like, you need to plant a flag as to what should be, right? What is best practice right now, and that would be true leadership in this space on a professional body level, and that's what they've gone and done, right? Nothing's perfect, but I think fundamentally it's definitely a decent starting point, and references appropriately things like the HE roadmap and other things. It's more consistent with that, and at least puts a marker down, which is good, because I think it's been always a bit too vague over time. So I think that's a really good recent development. A third thing that I like about the CSP, I've always been, and I'll come to this later, I've always been pretty impressed with the specialised nature of the trade union art. Personally found that beneficial, and there is a really strong argument for the nature of your reps understanding what it is to be a physio, which we'll come to, I'm sure, later, but also understanding the detail of that job. And that she can get some absolutely cracking trade unionists that work for broader trade unions, larger trade unions. And I don't want to get too into that, because there is a sort of union theme that I've been given questions on, but that is something that I would name in not necessarily a top three, but things that are just springing to mind that I like about it is that I think that the specialised nature of the trade unionism and the structures of which I've seen them work well. Some insights I've had as well from my wife, Charlotte, who's a CSP rep, as well as then sort of trade unionism and my family and my background and stuff, means that that's something that I do admire. So I think that's me three. Well, three things I don't like about the CSP. I think trying to make sure I prioritise them appropriately, but I suppose I'm just going to think of, like I just did, the top three that kind of come into my mind. One is that I've always been frustrated and vocal about the lack of transparency to member communication. So separating off, say, public communication, how the CSP presents to, say, wider society beyond its membership, but the sort of member communication I've always found to be lacking transparency, a bit condescending, doesn't seem to really comprehend what it means, that what level of professional conduct people or competence people clearly have in order to be a member, right? So what shared language can we speak? What is that identity you can speak to that means that you can use, you can assume a certain amount of someone in order to then communicate further interprofessionally, compared to just putting out stuff that sometimes there's no differential language between what's going out to the public and what's going out to us as members. So it's just, we're never able to kick on and have a really decent interprofessional dialogue. That's a personal opinion in terms of wider comms style as an organisation, and I feel like that's a bit behind the times. I think they're always trying to manage the narrative, which seemed to be the case on a wider comms style thing. That's a famous sort of thing that I find myself disagreeing with the CSP on. However, these are sorts of more ops-based decisions. They're quite abstract. I don't necessarily see that as being something I'll be able to influence as well as I'd like, I guess, maybe in the CSP's council. But it's one that, just to be admitting to my answer to that question. Another thing I didn't like that's fairly recent that I've just remembered the other day was the Love Activity Hate Exercise campaign. And I think that the reason I've thought about that more recently is, whilst I understood the premise, I think it was badly delivered, and also just like vagaries over the outcomes, like what would success have looked like, and how can we measure it now that it's a few years on. But I think contrasting to the clarity of message on the Stronger My Way campaign, which I quite like at the moment, and will be, I've got some resources, and certainly when the dust settles on this and Therapy Live and stuff, I plan to be more vocal about that. I can sort of see there's more to grab there, and also you can see the mechanism of which they're going to use ambassadorships to kick that on. So it was just an interesting contrast. I wasn't a big fan of that campaign, both structurally and its sort of clumsiness of messaging. A third thing I don't like about the CSP is I suppose the lack of engagement that is attracted. Now, I don't necessarily see that as being a fault of the CSP, but it's just one of those things where the confliction messaging between you are the CSP member-led organisation, and then the poor engagement levels mean that then that ends up being something that's difficult to act on, and that's something that I hope we can redress over time. That would be really nice if we can have more people involved in influencing decision making. And so what's often said is that the CSP's engagement levels in terms of voting and survey response rates and stuff is similar to organisations of its size on a percentage level. But what is really unique about the CSP in many ways is that for various reasons, the CSP has a far higher percentage of its members. How do I put this? The CSP has a higher percentage of physiotherapists as its members than other organisations of its type. So it's equivalent in other professions. It might only have, say, 30% keen beans that happen to be a particular type of architect or something like that, or its equivalent healthcare bodies, might only have its smaller organisation would be members of a professional body, something like that, or even a trade union. Whereas the CSP has a lion's share, I think it's 90+% of state registered physiotherapists in this country are also chartered physiotherapists in this country. So there's lots of reasons for that. But because of that, you'd think that then that appetite that makes people decide to be chartered members, why does that not then translate to better engagement levels? Like the responsibility is there for us to engage people more and not be complacent in thinking, oh, well, it's similar levels on a percentage basis. I think that's what's disappointing. So I am going to stop for breath for a second. Thank you so much for those that are commenting. I definitely will come to those in a second. If anyone's got, actually, before I move themes, so I'm going to go on to sort of a couple of more trade union-y questions. If you've got any, if you're tuning in live, then please do post your comments and stuff, and I'll come to them between each of the sections, which I'll do now. So hi to Talita. She says she's over on Facebook as far as I can see. I think you'll definitely ruffle a few feathers when, not if you get elected. That's a vote of confidence from Talita. That's really nice, and ruffle some feathers. Yeah, I think obviously it's difficult, isn't it? I think it's certainly style-wise, less so substance-wise these days, but style-wise, certainly I do ruffle feathers sometimes, and that some people do, naturally. Some people are sort of dispositionally more conservative and do want to continue status quo, and so typically people are smoothing feathers as well as ruffling feathers, and I suppose I'm better known for the latter. It's fair enough, but I hope not internally. I think there's some great work being done at the CSP that I want to help with rather than just piss everyone off. Luke asked, you spoke about shared language. In light of this, do you think Northerners should be allowed within the CSP Council? And if so, should they adopt a Southern accent to appease the South? I knew I'd get really serious questions from the live stream. This is kind of what about 20 of the 52 questions that I got before looked like this. And see, I started reading it and now I was taking it seriously. But yeah, to answer your question, Luke, I think it's absolutely reasonable that all regional accents should be suppressed, and that everyone should sound, the classic estuary English that is the homogenous nature of the UK. It's so funny how much my accent comes up on streams, and most of the time it's good playful banter, and other times it's like people do get a bit funny about it, like what would you know? Or regional northern accents, they're dead common, aren't they? So we sound dead thick, which obviously in my case is true, but I don't think it's necessarily fair. Right, let me get on with other stuff then. I'm going to move on to the next category if there's no further questions. The theme would be trade union. What did I learn from going to ARC this week? For those that don't know, I went along to the annual REPS conference, which is a CSP event where the stewards, that's the sort of trade union stewards, health and safety stewards, and now EDI stewards as well, a new type of rep in there that come together, and they debate motions that are submitted. Now, it's not just a trade union conference. It was great. I spoke up with Alex McKenzie briefly, and she, quite rightly reminded me, because one of my reasons for going was because, I don't know as much about the trade union side and its mechanisms and governance as I do maybe the other stuff that I've been more involved in historically. But she quite rightly reminded me that it's kind of, that it could and should be more involved across the piece of the whole organisation. But there was only 7 delegates there from the professional networks, for example, which are then the constituent parts of the professional body classically. And so it ends up being more a trade union conference. But it was really useful to see that in action, see some of the dialogue, the debates, the characters, some of the talent. But more importantly, I guess the passion. I learned a lot about the fact that it threw me back. I haven't really been as active in trade union related issues for a few years. The last time I was when we took on a mayor, and we had the mayoral elections in Manchester. And so through the TUC, I was quite involved in that and more politically engaged with that, as to understand what was being devolved in health and how that would impact it. And I felt like I wanted to understand that for Physio Matters, as well as just for myself personally. And for the last few years, I've been less involved in that sort of stuff. So it was really cool to be back in that atmosphere and watching the movers and shakers in that direction. I certainly learned and asked a lot of questions, obviously in the breaks and stuff, of what people feel they feel supported on and what they feel less supported on. And a big thing really was that the amount of times that people say that they really felt like they should and could know more, and then months or years into a role they realise that there are resources or characters or mentors that then help to join the dots for them, that there could be maybe better structures to help them on that direction. But there was a common theme as well, that people did feel that there was stuff there that just wasn't as accessible as they'd like. And so that was certainly a few lessons learned. But yeah, really enjoyed it and learned an awful lot. Annoyingly, I took over clinic on the Wednesday, so I only got the Tuesday, which was a shame. And caught up with some old friends and met some new friends as well. It was really interesting. This is obviously a spicy question. I got this in 2 forms, really. I've got one later where someone asked if it's an effective professional body. I have alluded to my answer to this question already. Yes, I do think it is. I think it's very effective with regards to its specificity. I think that's really interesting, and a lot of people take that for granted. In our game is the fact that then your steward and your regional reps and then your national representatives, if it goes any further, are highly specialised in understanding the roles, the responsibilities, the competence, the educational entry, the levels of detail to comprehend what it is that's your role, and the policies and typical contracts and all that sort of stuff is really useful. And it's therefore, yes, I think an effective trade union. There are obvious areas vulnerable or weaker, which I think are well mitigated in certain ways, but generally on a national level, compared to your big boys, with Unite and Unison and the like, it's something that quite rightly the CSP has to collaborate across some of the smaller unions in order to get itself heard on that bigger picture. But increasing amounts of, say, councillors and politicians further up the chain, even MPs that are former physios and stuff, is only going to help the cause. So, but yeah, I think it's pretty effective, and that, yeah, whilst it has its challenges in terms of size, I think it punches above its weight. I think it's very impressive in many ways for that. From further more I look into it, and also some experience I have from Shah. She's been impressed with her training. So it's my wife, if you're just tuning in. That's my wife, who's a CSP rep, and yeah, they've trained her well. Is the CSP conflicted as both a trade union and a professional body? So this is something that I have mused on a lot over the years. So my views changed from those that have heard them before a little bit. But more generally, I think it can be. I think we sometimes hide from where it is. I think there's some people have got blind spots for where it's quite obviously a conflict, but it needn't be. I've gone from being someone that just could not see a route forward without that without that split. And I'm now a bit more agnostic to whether it can or not. So it needn't be conflicted, but I think it currently is. I think there's a poor dialogue internally and within the membership about where it is conflicted, and therefore those issues aren't really resolved. So I think that's an area which could be tidied up for sure. A classic thing. It's not. I don't really want to use specific examples because which one I pick ends up biasing things. It's a bit too. So for now, I'll just use sort of in the abstract. Is that you could argue that a trade union is there to sort of defend the rights and practices of physiotherapists in many ways, as long as they've not been sort of unsafe or illegal or breached policy, then they're going to just defend their position and what they're being challenged and called on, regardless, which of course it should. But then as a professional body, which is striving for an improvement and raising of standards and an extending of scope and the demonstration of competence, sometimes those things can really help each other. And other times you've got those that are dragging standards being supported by a trade unit, and rightly so in terms of sort of their rights, or that people might be sort of being compromised for their employability for being of say poor standard, whilst the professional body is trying to then demonstrate and lead from the front. So again, a bit of an abstract one than a specific one, which wouldn't be fair for now. But that's where classically I've been critical of this potential issue, potential conflict. But need it be? No. Is it? Yes, a little bit. I find it frustrating, and I've never had great answers on that question from those involved. But obviously, times are changing, and as I said, I've been moved on that. I used to be couldn't see a route forward, and then I've sort of at least been persuaded that it could be better and might be better in the future. This is an interesting question that was given to me a couple of times actually from people at the annual reps conference that I met on Tuesday, as well as then a few of you sending me messages about it, asking me to talk about this. I think it's a really interesting one because I'm not someone that is naive enough to think that you can separate off politics from much anytime, never mind these days. And so I think the CSP would be naive if it thought it could be apolitical. But equally, I think it's really clumsy if it becomes too narrowly party political, which is very difficult in our country, particularly with the two major parties and stuff, and the history and legacy of natural tethering between, say, trade unions and the Labour Party. I think what's funny about physiotherapy as a profession, when I've thought about it over the years, sort of ethically, I'm a fairly political person myself, very much not party political, absolutely loathe the two major parties. That's an admission from me for those that might be new around here. Various interesting intersections with the Labour Party over the years. Certainly never been or voted or can much tolerate Tories, I'll admit. But I will say I can't really think of a route forward if the CSP thinks it can be partisan on many issues, or naive enough to think that then things like condemning government policy on or what have you isn't going to be political. There was an interesting point where someone had said, I don't like this motion because it's political. Someone stood up and said, no, it's not political, it's moral. And the motion said, denounce government policy, right? Own it. It's bad if it's bad policy. Own it, and then you can have a dispute necessarily as conference and as an organisation as to whether or not we should be that political, so overtly political. But you can't try and pretend that isn't. It's like, and it is political, and it's all right to be if it's something that's so obnoxious to you, and then to that room, and then to the wider membership. It's like if that's what we think, and the we is appropriately disseminated across, semi-democratic process that we have, then it's reasonable. So one of the things that I think, and I'll come to this later, is just prioritize areas in which it intersects appropriately with physiotherapy and with healthcare. I think this just sometimes people do channel their natural proclivity to activism on a particular topic, which is absolutely fine. I love passion. I love people who have their sort of more hobbyist passions. It's just that the CSP as an organ for change in that direction is better off where it does intersect with healthcare, with physiotherapy, etc., rather than it being a potentially ineffective way of channeling your activism, rather than more specific other organisations, think tanks, and lobbies, where I think your energy would be better spent to some degree. And so the CSP having positions and statements and making sure it doesn't being so naive as to think it can be apolitical is really wise. But generally speaking, I think it'd be really clumsy if it got dragged too far the other way and became too political in a, say, party political sense. So that's the last few. That's me giving a few questions in the direction of the theme of trade unionism, which came in. Any questions from you guys that are tuning in live regarding that? Otherwise, I will move on to our next category, which is EDI. But Jim, hi, he said, do you think you can actually enact meaningful change from the inside? If you've just tuned in, Jim, then you might not have heard me say that I actually don't think realistically that is my primary goal. One of the questions I was asked is, what do you think you'll achieve? And I actually don't think that necessarily any sort of my personal agenda or anything like that can really make a difference. I hope that a certain amount of my sort of style, perchance for questioning, some disruption, just to try and broaden the understanding, broaden the dialogue, try and bring some data to the party, try and help us to understand and balance what does that look like? How can we better draw in more views, more engagement to the discussion? That I hope I'd be able to influence meaningful change on. But as far as actual specifics, I am really I haven't got a particular policy agenda in mind, in case that might be what you were meaning. So if there are no further questions on the trade union side, then we move on. So the next sort of theme for the questions that came in on the Ask Me Anything stuff was EDI. If you don't know what EDI stands for, it's equality, diversity, and inclusion. And the first sort of I'm trying to catch all as much as I can from a few questions on this, but what are your thoughts on the CSP's approach to EDI issues? I think that historically, I think it's been poor. I think that's been fairly well documented and well reflected on by the current organisation. I think it's a little bit of, again, I use this word, a bit naivety. I think there's been some stuff that have been some fairly harrowing stories of people being under-supported where they've faced significant discrimination. I think that the more recently, because this question obviously I can throw back, but more recently I can see appropriate noise being made, significant difference following the death of George Floyd, and some improvements in both rhetoric and infrastructure. Now, I think infrastructure is one of the things that I think is significantly better, and my understanding of that has really helped in recent months, particularly meeting people on Tuesday, where you can see how there is the EDB strategy, which I'll come to in a second because there's a question on that, but there's also then EDI committees. There are special interest groups within the CSP as professional networks for protected characteristics, which I think is really useful. And so you've got that, again, that specialist knowledge of how that is affecting in your social change, feeding into the EDI committee in the EDI wider EDB strategy. But then also you've got these EDI reps on the ground, and that accessibility in practice for those that are facing discrimination, having that point of reference, point of contact. Now, one of the things we need to make sure we follow up on, and I think I'll come to this a little bit later, is that then how we can make sure that those reps in new roles can understand and be supported in that, so that they don't get isolated or be at risk of facing down incredibly tense and fraught circumstances. Like, how well linked can they be to the stewards, to the health and safety reps, etc., as well as then confidants for those that are facing, some of the worst sort of bigotries that you can imagine in these roles, and also, again, as I said, how that intersects and affects people's health and education and other fundamental ways in which we can live to be as happy as possible and flourishing. And so that's where I think the CSP has definitely structurally made progress, as well as rhetorically in recent years. But I think that, historically, and I think if you haven't already, then I'd look back over some of the work that both through our channels, but also like elsewhere, Frontline, etc., that Ishmael Beckford and Leanne Antoine, not just them, but some of the stuff that they highlighted, where like here's some data, here's some stuff, here's objective, here's subjective, here's experiences and accounts that need to change, and especially with regards to sort of why we can't make progress on this together if we can, be honest about what the mistake's been made. I think that was really powerful stuff. So that was kind of when they were getting elected onto council, and hopefully I can work with them again soon. Another question, which is obviously linked to that, is what do you think of the CSP's EDB strategy? The difference in acronym there is that the CSP has an equity, diversity, and belonging strategy. I think it's good work. I think I think one of the things that it does highlight well is the prioritising of sort of cultural competence and making sure that we're all on the same hymn sheet with regards to stamping out bigotry and the exclusive nature of how some people can be, especially as healthcare professionals. You want to make sure that you have a better understanding and as broad as possible education across certain topics. And so I think it does that well. I think the makeup of our profession being as closely aligned to the makeup of any given community, I think is really valuable. I think it's one of the strongest arguments, of course, for prioritising this work. I think where it's weaker, and I kind of give it a bit of a pass on this because no strategy as a document can go as broad as this, but generally speaking, it's weaker on the how, right? Where the lower hanging fruit on something like this is the analysis, the diagnosis of a sort, whilst complex and systemic and murky. The how you resolve those things and how that looks as a profession, where it's situated culturally, and what we can do to move the needle in our space, as well as then the broader sort of cultural implications on that, I think is more challenging. And so the EDB strategy as a document, if those haven't read it yet, then do. I think that's an area where it can and no doubt will, through the infrastructure that exists and the reps and the committees and stuff, will move us towards the sort of how are we going to do that and how can we make sure that we act on it. This was an interesting question, kind of a couple that were seen around this, not just for me personally, but I saw some stuff on Twitter as well. I think it's absolutely a fair point. How do you propose we move beyond lip service on EDI issues? One of the questions was that people had quoted me on this, saying that I'd suggested that there had been too much lip service. I think this is one that's difficult because what people's definition is, what is it that people want as action. Again, if you agree on the analysis but you disagree on the actual action, then sometimes people can feel that by someone not taking the action that they would prefer, that's them paying lip service to a topic and not taking it seriously. And that's not always the case. So, how do I propose we move beyond lip service on EDI issues? Is that you make sure that then the analysis is appropriately thorough and that you engage sensibly, explaining and articulating your reasoning. And I think that's one of the things that can sometimes be lacking, is that sometimes you might grab for talking points and not be thorough and detailed. I think another area is to make sure that we don't overindulge a sense of over-splitting. And recognizing where some of these things do appropriately intersect, and where we can learn from fighting for causes where we can make a difference that doesn't necessarily constantly offer over delineated division. Because of course, if you keep splitting, you end up in individual rights, which is absolutely fantastic. But if you then end up over isolating small groups, then that's not helpful. And so I think that's one of the areas where we can, is to articulate not just our positions on things, but also the rationale behind them, not hide away from where things do sometimes collide, where it can become difficult, not be naive in thinking that we don't have our version of a wider cultural problem, not being silly in thinking that we're keeping our blinkers on and trying to do things in isolation when there's a wider conversation going on, and also keeping in touch as best we can with the views of the public, not necessarily that we'd agree with, but I mean like that broader polling data that we can draw on, as well as then understanding political and cultural trends and where we might be responsible for better understanding that, because that's obviously the demographic that we treat, as healthcare professionals in this country, trying to improve our social reputation and as well as initiate and educate people in sort of social justice. So I'm about to move on to another theme, which is on professional body issues, which is, I've got this funny identity question about physiotherapy, which is good. But yeah, we'll have a swig of water before we get onto that. And so as I'm going into a different category, and my final category, apart from miscellaneous, I'm going to take a breath. I'm going to take a drink. But if you have any other questions on that, any other questions from those that are tuning in live about EDI issues, I've had a couple of text messages from people saying that they've been commenting on things like Twitter and LinkedIn. It doesn't look like they're coming through to me. So I'm sorry, I only seem to be getting, I've got Facebook messages. I don't know if anyone's commented on YouTube. That's obviously usually a quiet feed, but I don't know if they're working. But unfortunately, I'm sorry if you are contributing on Twitter and LinkedIn, then I can't read those. If you really do want to get a question through, then I'll come to it as best I can. If someone can post that onto Facebook or YouTube, I think should be working. But the other ones sometimes are a bit glitchy, and I don't seem to be getting those through. So apologies for that. So anyway, yeah, no further questions. Then let's move on to professional body issues. I thought this was quite interesting. What does it mean to me to be a physiotherapist? I think the answer of what does it mean to be a physiotherapist more generally, I'll go with first, because that does apply to me. Really, it means that you have a usually entry point of bachelor's degree or equivalent or grandfathered across into being a physiotherapist of that level, that you then have that title. That's what qualifies you for a title that is then protected under law and can't be masqueraded as without justification and state registration. What does it mean to me to be a physiotherapist? I think that kind of starts to come towards what is the je ne sais quoi, what is the USP, which is harder to define. I think one of the things that is interesting is you then have this, what appropriate stereotypes can you indulge for physiotherapy? It's a broadest form. It's got a huge diversity of all different things, including sort of temperament and disposition. So you shouldn't really overindulge, and definitely shouldn't overindulge stereotype as if to imply that is what that's narrowly defining physiotherapy. But there's something solution focused. There's something proactive. There's something quite inherently energetic, not necessarily extroverted, but energetic about the way in which we might drive towards problem solving. It's been often said in departments that there is a relevant difference there. You can tell who the physio is, and they're not just meaning the blue bad trousers. And so that's meaningful to me. And I think that that's something that we should be very proud of. I also think that it's something that physiotherapy is really interesting position, whereby it's a minority health profession compared to, say, medicine and nursing, but it's still also within, say, more rehab professions, a big fish, compared to, say, MSK game, osteopathy and sports therapy and sports rehab and stuff like that. And so you've got this really interesting position that it is, and that applies as well to its sort of infrastructure, including the CSP. And so, yeah, I hope that's not too bad an answer, but it's an interesting one. And at the heart of it, I am proud to be a physiotherapist. In the main, there are plenty of times in which I'm not, and then I'm always having to convince myself that neither the best of us or the worst of us represent us, and that's why I think competence and a governance structure that can justify as to what it means, and what we can be confident of each other having been through and being held to as a code of conduct and standards is something that we constantly negotiate, and a process in which we constantly negotiate as to what you are able to be a physiotherapist or even a chartered physiotherapist is something that is going to be a decision across a membership organisation, which of course I could end up the wrong side of the line on, and that's always the social negotiation that is to be sort of a mature organisation as well as a mature participant in society, is to have those discussions and debates. So much like the question earlier about trade union, same person, or a couple of people actually had said, is the CSP an effective professional body in your opinion? I said yes to the trade union question, even though that is an area of which I've not as much interacted with or been as involved, certainly as a unionist. Whereas with the professional body, I've been more involved. I don't think so necessarily, no. Over the course of time, I can see areas in which I can see driving for improvement, but as a general rule, a professional body for me, the priorities would be putting lines in the sand for best practice, for better unifying between sectors, better unifying a common cause, because if you think about a professional body representing physiotherapy, that would be something that would, done well and being effective, would help with the identity issues that would not necessarily mean that there are issues and collisions that can occur between, say, private sector, public sector, as well as then the other charity and sporting sectors, of which we have various different places, positions in. And that obviously does come to heads in MSK more than it does elsewhere, but in paediatrics and neuro and stuff, a lot of colleagues reaching out to me over time, as well as more recently, you can imagine, about those sorts of things. And definitely, I think that's an area of mismanagement so far, which I think needs to turn a corner on. But there are, some changes afoot there, which I've been impressed with. Part of the review recently on private sector and stuff, and those voices being heard. So let's hope for progress there. I think another area why I consider it to not be at the moment is the mistakes that get made in trying to help to try and forge a common identity without then thinking that then is somehow heresy to imply that some of the things that we are known for aren't necessarily things that we are best at, right? So I always use something like rehabilitation as a brilliant unifier, and I put that in my address really because I really mean the functional scaling of people is such an interesting unifier across physiotherapy. But also, sometimes people try to say that we're the experts in and then insert something that there's actually plenty of other professions that doing that, and mainly that, in such a way that they have the edge on us. And sort of exercise prescription is a classic one, or having a better comprehension of the specificity or not as applied for exercise prescription is that as a standard, bachelor's entry or beyond that in time, that is not something that I think is provable by competence when compared to others. And so we need to just make sure that we're straight with, there's plenty to be proud of, but we also don't need to kid ourselves into thinking that there aren't some gaps there or areas in which we're lagging behind and we can raise standards again. So that complacency can set in sometimes. And I think that a professional body worth its salt would be again, championing best practice, but also trying to identify what the competency line is, that then if through a credible process people are not achieving that standard of practice that we aspire to and expect of each other as peers, then through a credible process, that would be something that would not necessarily make you a chartered physiotherapist. It's something that then there could be a differential there. Whether legally practice, of course, it's for the HCPC to decide, not the CSP. But certainly, I'd say between those two organisations, the regulator and the professional body, I think there could be a better, full-throated argument for minimum standards, at least aspiring to excellence. And I think that's where CSP has been weak, in my opinion. What issue? Let's have a look. What's this say? What issues can unite the profession and what risk dividing it? I've kind of answered that, haven't I? There. Sorry, got ahead of myself. I think rehab. I'm obsessed with it. It's a massive passion of mine. I've had some grief from friends of mine who aren't as into it, but yeah, I do. I think my wife's a paediatric respiratory physio, and I say she treats poorly children, and I treat well adults. But whilst we don't talk about it all the time, the act of assessing someone thoroughly and then coming up with individualized goals in which you then scale their function to where they want to get to, that's relevant to them. That's what we both do. It's just that the sort of baseline is different, and the circumstances and specialism that helps us to make those reasoning-based decisions is different. But the fundamentals of what we're applying in terms of anatomy, physiology, communication, understanding what human, shall I dare I say, norms are on biomechanics, what challenges someone, what challenges them less, what equipment, what technologies, right? So there's so many great unifiers, but I would say always that rehab is one. Also, I think that the ways in which not just rehabilitation, but that idea I mentioned about being solution focused, being proactive, being go-getters of a sort, getting stuck in and fighting for injustice. You think about those things that we will do all day, every day with patients to match them for determination and really go into bat for our clients, patients. I think that applies to trade unionism as well as aspiring to best standards. And I think the CSP and physiotherapists in general, that can unite us, is to get shared causes and fighting against major injustices when they occur. What risks dividing it? I think it's mainly if we can't answer those questions, if we can't recognise where that shared interest is. I also think another one worth mentioning on this is if we're not consistent intellectually, so there's areas in which we've been classically squashed, right? Physios and other HPs been kept out of top jobs. They talked a lot about the glass ceiling of directorships and stuff like that not being available to HPs and being run by nurses and stuff, and therefore not being understood, like a empathy issue where we're not necessarily understood. I think it's a great point, by the way. It's not a fair, it is an injustice, but unfortunately, in my opinion, I think the CSP's been pretty guilty of making exactly the same mistakes with professions smaller than it. So it's hypocritical. It's easy for it to shake its fist up at medicine, that's obviously got a longer legacy and has that infrastructure and governance and funding and political will that physiotherapy hasn't necessarily got. The CSP, when rightly shouting upwards, there is in the right. But unfortunately, smaller professions, of which then are suggesting that a more inclusive nature of who's best qualified to do X, I think the CSP is incredibly hypocritical on that sometimes, where it then implies a really relevant difference between it and others when it would never stand for that argument when looking above itself, shall we say, towards medicine, pharmacy, nursing, etc. And so I just think that that's a consistency issue, that if we don't, we just look silly. Like I said, the world is more transparent now. You can't hide from that. So we just look silly if we're not consistent on it. So ridding ourselves of the hypocrisy is going to help us. If we don't, then I think that's where splinters will occur. People just will increasingly not identify with either the organisation or the profession increasingly, which I think would be a real shame. So that's enough from me about professional body issues. I've got a few miscellaneous questions, and I'm probably not going to get them done in 5 minutes, but I'm going to try. As I said, an hour, and I'm on track. And I've got 52 bloody questions, including 18 of them that I hadn't noticed until like half an hour before I came live. I know what I've made a mistake of here. I've not put this overlay on. There's been a few questions about climate change, and I was meaning to be clever and to put a picture up. Or maybe I can do it now on the fly. Maybe I can be clever after all. So yeah, various different questions about climate change, and it came up a bit at again the annual reps conference. So what do I think about it? But there's a I don't know, like a lobby emerged. Physio declares climate emergency on Twitter, and so I like this type of action. They are saying to, I think the tweet that's prior to this said something like, "We call on the CSP Council elects or whatever to answer these questions." So here I am. What do you think are the main challenges climate change poses to healthcare? I think that the absolute, the big, on its biggest level, the main challenges are that it's going to impact everything, and that the weakest, most vulnerable in society are always going to suffer under that. And so the two big passions for me, healthcare and education, are going to be massively impacting those that are most vulnerable, and that the nature of everything from sea level rising through to broader migration challenges that are going to be caused by areas that shouldn't be so hot being so hot, areas that aren't equipped to be as cold as they are becoming colder. Those sorts of macro level things worldwide. That's really, really silly. The failure. We cannot make the mistake of being naive to the political implications of that, and making sure we don't navel gaze and indulge a sense of blinkered nationalism that then starts to imply country and continental borders as if they've got a certain relevance. That means that then you can't understand the way in which the world is changing, and the world is going to also shrink in certain areas. So that's an area that's always going to impact healthcare, because especially when we understand on a biopsychosocial model, that the challenges and stress that's going to cause all different manner of people in all different manner of ways. I mean, on a narrow level, think about just like the flooding implications that then has on the stress of individuals of which lose homes and businesses and the like. It's like, what on earth are we doing if we don't then recognise that is going to be a social factor affecting symptomology, stroke risk, and heart disease and stuff, right? So everything about it really is going to impact on healthcare. What's your vision for physiotherapy profession within sustainable healthcare? I think where I am on stuff like this is to make sure we try and pick the areas in which it most intersects with physiotherapy, right? If you're particularly passionate about climate change and corrections for ecological issues, then I think there are, whilst definitely CSP is one arm in which you can channel that energy, but there are definitely bigger and better, more efficient organisations in which you could prioritise some of that. So that doesn't excuse it. I'm not trying to pass that buck, but I'm just thinking that where the CSP should be prioritising things is the areas in which it closely intersects with healthcare, and namely physiotherapy, where we can make a big difference and we can lead by example on it. Some cracking examples came up at ARC, which was good. One that didn't, which was annoying, is sustainable PPE. I think it's sort of, again, an annoying hypocrisy that some of the same people that are, 1 minute they were all for the Attenborough effect and decreasing plastics, and the next minute they're trying to put us in 3 aprons that were completely unnecessary for 3 years or whatever, right? People don't always necessarily recognise that level of hypocrisy, which is annoying. So sustainable PPE is brilliant, and trying to drive the price down on that and leading by example on it. I've not seen anything from the CSP on that, whether or not they can or not, I'm not sure. Again, I don't know if that would be a position I'm on council, but I can definitely make those introductions because there's some fantastic work being done on dropping the price of sustainable PPE, and it'd be a shame if just because we're not clad in it as much as we were a few years back, it'd be a shame if that wasn't on the agenda. So that should be one. Another one that was great that was brought up at ARC, the lad called Luke, who brought up the fact, and I didn't have a clue about this, but certain types of inhaler are terrible for the environment, and that switching to a dry powder one is therefore far better, and that physiotherapists being able to advise that and to help people with inhaler technique. And of course, physiotherapy to therefore decrease your need for said inhalers. I can't think of it. Well, I'd never thought of that as a specific example. What a brilliant and targeted strategy for stuff like that. So yeah, hats off to that lad Luke for enlightening me to that, and various members of the conference that probably didn't know that. Well, maybe it was just me, but everyone else was aware of this. But think about that, right? Not just for usage of type of, but also the decreased need for. Fantastic. What a good example. And other things like that, where again, specificity matters. Broader rhetorical optics is fair enough. I don't know with regards to like how important it is that the CSP declares or not. Less important for me than the specifics, if I'm honest. I think that sometimes that can be a bit larpy. But yeah, third question: are there any changes you'd like to see at the CSP to address the climate emergency and support sustainable practices? I've made the mistake of answering both questions at once there, I think, haven't I? A little bit, because I think those sorts of changes I'm on about. I think one thing would be to try and get it right in terms of those priority points. It's a bit like my answer about politics earlier, is how, because I know there's going to be plenty of people, members and staff and councillors perhaps even, that have a difference of opinion as to how political or how much we should weigh in on the broader moral issues, where I might be being, for their taste, too specific. And so I think, I will admit, and I've thought about this a lot, is that I would rather the CSP prioritise both time and funds, which are often the same thing, into the areas of which we can have the maximum impact. Now, when you have some success on that issue, there's no way you stop that. You use that as a thin end of a wedge, and you broaden into a wider position of social justice for me, right? And so, as I said before, I would say like on EDI, I think it just means that when you have some success in that direction, in the areas and demonstrating real progress on equality, then you are in a position to use that and leverage that that blueprint and be an example for other both organisations and the challenges that faces. I think it's not dissimilar in some ways with regards to climate change. Imagine just those two examples with regards to PPE and inhalers. There's a risk, of course, if you go too narrow, then you're missing the bigger picture, and that's not going to do anything, right? That's pissing in the ocean, for want of a better expression. Probably not the right expression for climate change, is it that? But generally speaking, there is a risk of that. I do get it. But if the CSP is expected, or physiotherapy at large, or healthcare at large, it's just like, no, ignore the little petty things. You know, those that you're mentioning, Jack, are just equivalent of plastic straws, and that don't matter nearly as much as these things. You're at risk of just whinging and whinging and whinging and really struggling to make any real differences, because those are macro political issues, which of course are important, but essentially that's an area where, you know, admittedly I'll say that there's just one of the reasons why I think this is partly because I do not believe in the entire dismantlement of all things natural resources right away. You know, the urgency that's sometimes being implied there. I don't share the politics of someone like George Monbiot. Is it called Monbiot? I don't know how you pronounce it, but you know, those sorts of, you know, fully dismantle all capitalist structure ASAP, and usher in a sort of eco-communism, you know, ASAP. You know, again, good luck. I've heard that argument. I've seen it try and play out and stuff. And while that's a wider macro political project that I'll keep an eye on, of course, you know, that for me is where, if CSP time, funds, and the passion and energies of some of the brightest in our profession ends up being not narrowly focused, but almost broadly focused on something like that, as being like that's the priority, then that's what's a problem there. Another question that came up on the sort of climate change thing that came in separately, where are we there? Was about the, you know, how much am I in support of certain actions that are seen as being extreme or dramatic. So they were naming things, and this came in last week, and so I talked to a few people about it at ARC. And so it's an absolutely fair point, is that personally, and certainly when it comes to sort of what the CSP encourages or condones, is that there are certain people that feel that the ends justifies the means, and that the climate emergency is such that therefore, you know, certain actions are fine to be taken in such a way that they'll glue themselves to a random person's Land Rover on the school run and stuff like that. Yeah, I just cannot understand it. I nearly said I can't understand it. No, I can understand it. I feel I can understand the logic of it completely clearly, but I absolutely don't support it, and I think it is misguided. I also think it's absolutely one of the most dangerous things in the world, in a way, to think that the ends justifies the means, because you think that. That's your view, often ideologically possessed when it becomes the extreme. And unfortunately, there are some nasty gits on the other side of the argument that are likely, if they started to do that, then you wouldn't like what that world looks like. We do need to, as flawed as it is, channel that in through liberal debate and democracy, through action that changes laws. We can change cultural customs, but stuff like that, and gluing yourselves to random strangers' Land Rovers, yeah, you know, you're not getting me supporting that, unfortunately. And if, like I say, I've got questions to that effect, people interested in that. And it's more, in this case, that's not just me just giving you my politics. It's also just thinking that there are some people I know, and I spoke to some of them on Tuesday, which was great. We had a great conversation about it, that were, you know, that I think would be supportive of say, you know, the CSP backing more direct action that is questionable, at least in its legality. So any further questions on that, then please do let me know, but otherwise I'm going to move on because I'm in overtime. Sector clashes. Well, loads of questions about that. How do I intend to back private practice and stuff? I mean, I'm a private practitioner and have had a career in the NHS. I've worked briefly in sport, in Hockey Health, for locums for a bit when we were putting the paint on these walls. You know, I've had a decent range. And I think that we find things that unite us and we push against the things that divide us. And that if people don't want to grow up and try and unify, then that's more for them. I won't entertain. Let me try. Yes. I won't entertain those that are overtly tribal and like really sneering and dismissive of certain sectors and painting with too broad a brush. But I also will not stand it when people imply that there isn't a problem when there is one, right? When you've got really obvious both objective and subjective factors being brought forward as to where there is an issue there between, say, a public and private sector. And that people do want to try and hide from it, right? They just think, no, all's well, when it's not. And that's not fair because people feel isolated and that's how they get disenfranchised. And that's why they bloody cancel their memberships and stuff. So we don't want that. But I've talked enough about sector classes. So if you're new around, then go and skip back a bit and you'll find me musing more on that. But I certainly have no intention of representing one sector or another. I'm well aware of the issues faced by private practice because I'm in them, the incredible and quite unique challenges in many ways. Also, the risk-taking behaviours that exist in entrepreneurship in small business, both in our world and not, are sometimes ignored and not understood. And therefore, that's one issue of which I'll certainly be championing. But similarly, there's plenty of stuff that I won't condone on that side of it that you all know about fairly well. Right. Efficiency and spending. There were loads of questions on this, and I'm not going to get to the specifics of them because of time now. But essentially, that is an area of operations that I'll be certainly leaving alone. Right. There's a committee. I forget the name of the committee, but it's just going to have such expertise that it's like the last thing you want is me weighing in with clumsy questions. Or it wouldn't be appropriate for any counsellor, I don't think, but certainly me. I totally understand the frustration of why you're spending on that and not this. But fundamentally, that is so ridiculous for me from the outside to think I can understand and comprehend all of those variables that affect those decisions. So I'm going to be absolutely fascinated to find them out. Certainly, if I feel like I can get closer to it and there's something to tell you, that I'll tell you. We'll find a way. Hopefully to tell you, but generally speaking, that's something that I think could be really, really clumsy. And also, I just want to tell those of you that think I'm going to vote for Jack as if he's going to go in. I'm going to go in and say don't spend on that and do spend on that. Ridiculous that you think that I definitely should not have any authority to do anything like that, and so just warning you that if that's what you're wanting or expecting, then don't be so silly. And then finally, this was a question that was one of the most asked, a version of this question, and so I've left it till last on this list. And I think it's a funny one because I wouldn't be running if I wanted to go in there and say, right, change nothing, status quo candidate, and but equally I wouldn't be running if I thought it was beyond help. So it's a funny one. Now, this question does say well run. It's a leadership question. I think it's been, it's an interesting one. It's been a really weird time. You think about the span of, let's just say, the last 5 years. You had a brief window of what you could argue is peacetime, although it's political chaos, and then you've got pandemic. So, who'd have envied that task? I know in the small organisations of which I have a role in leadership, including some that were, of course, embryonic when the pandemic hit, as well as my businesses, as well as other positions I have in a sort of commentary space that don't have overt goals and targets and that, but I know how difficult that was to get things right and the energy drain that occurred. And so there's a lot of things that I give a big pass to. And then there's other areas that I've been vocal about, including on this stream, where I think that there has been mistakes made and errors, but they're all forgivable. And they're all, for me, it's all about trying to make sure that then an opportunity is given for those that want to offer a critique without being called heretics or implying that that's something that's beyond the pale. And then there's also an opportunity for people to be called out if they think they can be tin pot revolutionaries and tear everything up. And I don't think I'm either of those people. I don't ask questions for the sake of it. I ask questions because I think that is a really positive way in which we can understand each other better. And so, you can come for the questions and stay for the answers. But generally, I hope to be able to join the CSP's council in order to offer myself to a body that is there to question and to scrutinise and to try to responsibly lead the profession in a strategic way, not spontaneously, not knee-jerk, trying to be proactive where it can be, but also reacting sensibly to the things as they emerge, not just in our profession, but where it intersects with wider culture. It's a fascinating role, and one that the more I looked into it, the more I fancied it, mainly because of timing. So to reiterate where I started, why now is because when things are a bit disrupted, the world is moving a little bit on the floor. I'm used to walking on that uneven ground. That is kind of what I've been doing. It's what I'm known for. If this was a steady state type time in some way, if there was less chaos in various different areas, I would not be appropriate and I would not be putting myself forward for it. Whereas it is, for me, good timing with various different things that I'm passionate about and have expertise in that are coming to the fore. And I also think that the time is now for us to get hold of them. And so I hope that you guys do fancy that and give me that opportunity. But also, if not, that's okay too. It's one of the things that I've always said is that making a case for something and then an opportunity for a group of people or even individuals to say, no, thank you, is part of what I've always said. And part of what I'd like to see the CSP do more of is to say, this is what we stand for, so that then others might, then if they say, and we disagree, they know where they can go. And in this case, I don't mean they can clear off like my way or the highway, but I'm meaning that make an argument, make a case. Let's have a better public dialogue, especially intra-professionally amongst the membership. Let's improve that professional dialogue amongst members and stop any miscommunication that can occur, or lack of communication that seems to fuel a lack of engagement in what is a very large organisation, considering the percentage of people that are physiotherapists that also are chartered physiotherapists that are part of then a member organisation that in some ways really punches above its weight, spread thin in other ways as well. And it's a complex one that I look forward to understanding better. So I'm not for a second pretending that I know all of it, but I'm getting to know it more. And I really fancy being involved. And one of the things I care most about really is that you channel people's sort of passion and interest. And I'm certainly someone that, name's on the title, right? I do think physio matters. And it'd be a real privilege to represent you if you did so. Vote me into council. So that's enough from me. Thank you very much. It's only an hour and 15. And when I said it'd be an hour, there were people probably doing a spread bet on it being more like 7 hours. So I'm quite pleased to finish at that. Thank you so much. If you have any further questions or comments, then please do leave them on this stream. I will check it. You can always find me usually on Twitter or on LinkedIn as Jack A. Chew on Twitter. Find me and add me on LinkedIn if you like. You can email info@physio-matters.com and point out that this is a question about the CSP, my CSP campaign, if you call it that, and the team can forward that on to me. But otherwise, thank you for all your support. It's been really lovely to hear from you, and thank you for the 52 bloody questions that I had to try and pull and curate for this. I didn't expect that. That's brilliant. So long may that continue. I certainly hope, if I am elected, to have as much access and a way of sort of curating that information and keeping my finger on the pulse as best I can with you all, as well as then increasing and broadening the scope, especially beyond MSK. To what we're about and what we're doing. All right, take care. Thanks a lot and have a lovely evening.